The forest still reeked of the metallic stench of the storm when a heavy silence settled among the broken trunks. Twisted branches formed a tangled shadow over the clearing newly opened by the landslide, and the thick mud bore chaotic marks of rocks, exposed roots, and sodden leaves. In the center of this scene of collapse, the forest ranger remained motionless, half submerged in the mud, his chest pressed against a colossal trunk that yielded only enough to sustain a thread of breath. The distant radio hissed inconstantly, like a forgotten echo of help, and the camera attached to his backpack flickered with a flickering light that barely captured the outline of the disaster. The day was slowly brightening, but the light seemed trapped, unable to penetrate the dense air. It was in this contained space between fear and survival that a figure emerged from the dark green. The female gorilla approached with measured steps, her back marked by mud splashes, her fur plastered with recent rain, her open, heavy hands cautiously touching the earth. The environment reacted to her presence with an almost religious recollection. The insects quieted their buzzing, the birds suspended their choreography, the foliage ceased their rustling. The distance between the animal and the man condensed into an axis of tension, as if the entire forest held its breath to observe the next gesture. There, before the trapped body, the female leaned slowly, assessing the strength of the trunk, the fragile rhythm of the thorax, the tiny response of the world on the verge of collapse. The camera, now set at an irregular angle, captured the instant the powerful hand landed on the mud beside the guard's shoulder. The touch didn't demand territory, it measured depths, committed to the task, almost like someone revising a map etched in their memory. For a brief moment, the forest ceased to be a threat and became the workshop for an unlikely rescue. The trunk creaked low as the gorilla tested it, first cautiously, then with increasing firmness, adjusting the base of her feet, shifting her weight, contracting her muscles with a discipline shaped by pain and persistence. With each attempt, a grain of the impossible gave way, and the mud responded with a harsh hiss, reminding her that any excess could sink the victim even deeper. Signs of exertion spread throughout the surroundings. Leaves clinging to broken branches began to drip, drops marking the irregular rhythm of tension, small stones rolling like pieces of a primitive clock. The female took a step back, repositioned her hands, adjusted her flank against the trunk, and tried again. Her entire body vibrated with the effort, her breathing quickened, the ground gave way millimeters, enough to suggest a chance. The image of that repeated, obstinate thrust lacked bravado. Rather, it carried a raw care, an engineering of instinct and memory. Somewhere, a search drone streaked through the canopy, and the metallic reflection of the device streaked the landscape with a pale line of human attention. Yet, on the ground, the choreography belonged to the animal and its decision. The title of what was happening seemed to write itself in the thick air. Gorilla finds injured guard trapped under a tree trunk. Her gesture leaves everyone in tears. There were no live witnesses in that critical second, but the forest itself, like an involuntary audience, seemed to contain an ancient emotion, made up of recognition and amazement. The female pressed her forehead against the trunk for a moment, as if measuring invisible vibrations, and once again concentrated her weight on her arms, this time in sync with a hip shift that increased the leverage. The next crack was sharper, the trunk tilted an inch, enough to relieve the pressure on the man's chest. A scratchy breath reorganized the air around her, and the vapor of her breath rose briefly but distinctly, like a fragile flame rekindled. The moment of near victory also ignited the risk. The mud shifted under the gorilla's hind foot, and the trunk threatened to roll in the opposite direction. She froze the movement, redistributed her forces, found a firm grip on an exposed root, and maintained pressure at the exact point where the greatest weight could be overcome. The scene gained density, not through speed, but through the calibration of every millisecond. The camera captured the sheen of water running down the bark, the tremor of her resistant fingers, the concentration that pierced her skin and manifested itself in the tense contours of her shoulders. Everything conspired toward a climax without screams, a climax constructed with silence and precision. When the first rescuers reached the edge of the clearing, they saw the scene like a living painting. The trapped man, the displaced trunk, the female gorilla supporting the impossible with her entire body. The human world, with ropes, stretchers, and protocols, hesitated at the door of the makeshift sanctuary. The forest still owned time. The female's gesture, however, opened a passage. She held her position until she sensed the presence of those who could complete the rescue, then took 2 steps back, without losing focus on the trunk, ready to intervene if the weight threatened to return. Her eyes followed every movement of the human hands, assessing, accepting, watching, like a guardian of a newly discovered boundary between species. The operation unfolded in seconds as dense as hours. The ropes passed through firm points. The levers gained traction. The trunk rose enough for trained arms to free the imprisoned body. The guard emerged from the mud with scarred skin, ragged breathing, and an irregular pulse, but whole enough to once again be the responsibility of the human world. The female watched, still and alert, as if the truth of the act lay less in the liberation itself and more in the assurance that life would resume. The helicopter approached, the wind kicking up leaves and dust, and the noise momentarily shattered the sanctuary. Yet, in that whirlwind, the central image remained intact, an animal lifting a weight that wasn't its own to preserve what it had recognized as valuable. As the stretcher rose, the clearing took its first painless breath. The female then retreated into the shadows, dissolving into the same green from which she had emerged. There was no triumph in her retreat, only the completion of a task fulfilled. The drone hovered for a few seconds, as if asking for a final confirmation, and captured the frame that would travel the world. Later, tears would spread across anonymous screens, silent applause would ripple through rooms, and debates would flare about instinct, empathy, and memory. There, however, in the final moment of the chapter, all that remained was the clearing regaining its pulse, the mud settling, the water finding ancient grooves, and the certainty that, to understand how that gesture became possible, it would be necessary to go back in time. From above, the forest regained its cathedral-like texture, and destiny, already mapped out, waited patiently for the story that would explain each ignored signal, each rupture, each memory that led a female gorilla to the act that moved the world. The morning began with a dull clarity, as if the sky was still debating whether to deliver sun or rain. The ranger's routine followed the same disciplined ritual, checking his equipment, checking the trails on the map, and mentally identifying the risk points that the rainy season always highlighted. He knew every corner of the reserve like the back of his own hand, and from this intimacy grew a kind of silent respect for the territory and its inhabitants. On the southern slope, the group of gorillas began the day with predictable movements, alternating slow movements with long feeding pauses. Among them, the female who had lost her calf kept a distance from the group, orbiting the edges with the cadence of someone still negotiating grief with time. The ranger observed from afar, attentive to the invisible hierarchies that maintained the harmony of that microcosm. Nothing seemed out of place. The air had just the right weight. The canopy whispered familiar whispers, and even the ground responded firmly to the boots that traversed the trails. Yet true peace is rarely complete. Small dissonances emerged like barely audible notes. At first, they were faded plastic tapes attached to a low branch, reminders of past raids. Then, fresh, distinctly patterned sole marks, clear enough to contradict the usual reading of patrol footprints. A dark, abnormally cut feather rested beside a partially debarked trunk. Minimal signs, but together, they created a warning relief. The fog began to lift, revealing patches of disturbed earth where none should have been, and a subtle trail of charcoal mixed with moisture betrayed the recent presence of fire on a reckless night. The ranger noted his observations, checked the radio, breathed the habit of someone who has learned to prioritize concrete data, and still pushed the discomfort to a manageable corner of his consciousness. The forest, after all, has always had noises that never become a storm. The female gorilla, for her part, moved with a restlessness that seemed to spring from within. Her body carried the memory of a world more unstable than humans care to admit. She sniffed the wind, identified the cross-scents of crushed leaves and fresh wood, assessed the troop with the calm of experience, and moved on, avoiding the main trail. The ranger noticed the indirect movement and mentally recorded the change in pattern. The gesture was not alarming in itself, but it added to the other small breaks in regularity. The radio crackled with a routine call, confirmation that another team would check the riverbank, and everything seemed to settle back into a semblance of normality. There was, however, an undercurrent of haste circulating between trees and rocks, like an ancient warning repeated in a low tone. The afternoon approached earlier than expected. High clouds pushed the light into a cooler hue, and the breeze carried the scent of rain still far away. The ranger adjusted his route to intercept a stretch of hillside where footprints converged, marked in the mud of an old landslide. He analyzed the angle of the prints, mentally measured the drying time, and estimated the direction of the intruder's exit. The calculations pointed to a less frequented clearing, a ring of young vegetation that had sprouted after a mother tree had fallen months earlier. As he advanced, he noticed the irregular silence of the birds, the delay in the amphibian chorus, the absence of a rodent that usually crosses the trail at this hour. All of this could mean nothing and, at the same time, say everything. Rationality insisted on classifying the findings as remnants of a past movement. Intuition, on the other hand, suggested a board still in play. The sun gave way to a tangled canopy. Elongated shadows reshaped the ground's topography. The ranger decided to record the scene on video, not for novelty, but for method. As he described the position of the clues with restrained gestures, the radio wavered again, lost clarity, then recovered, and the landscape resumed its usual indices. A banana leaf split in half, however, caught his attention because it was positioned like a makeshift arrow, pointing to nothing obvious. A literal reading suggested a prank or a trap. A practical reading recommended caution. He slowed, skirted a thorny bush, and emerged onto slightly clayey terrain, where his first step sank deeper than it should have. His body weight reacted, and an adjustment of balance restored stability, but the message was clear: the ground was demanding limits. At another point on the slope, the female gorilla described a wide semicircle, avoiding a corridor that had previously served as her passage. The troop kept its distance, trusting in the silent compass of those who lead without fanfare. She stopped, observed for too long a detail invisible to impatient eyes, resumed her march, and gleaned from the air a piece of information that reorganized her route. The forest, at that moment, seemed like a chessboard of parallel forces, where each discrete movement altered hidden variables. The guard and the gorilla, unseen, responded to the same tense tone, tuned by an ancient history of indirect encounters and past rescues. As the first drops fell, the smell of ozone preceded the reality of the rain. The ranger considered whether to return to base or complete the planned sweep. The evidence didn't justify an immediate retreat, and the weather, though unstable, hadn't yet become a concrete threat. The decision was to continue a few more meters, complete his reading of the terrain, and close the loop of possibilities. He advanced through a narrow passage, flanked by thick roots that emerged from the ground like twisted columns. At a certain point, he noticed a tall trunk, split in half, supported by a tangle of vines and thinner branches, in a precarious geometry. His gaze assessed its stability, calculated safety margins, and mentally mapped out a return path. The forest is not a school of certainties, but of probabilities. At that moment, the odds seemed reasonable. The rain fell without formal warning, and the sound of impact on large leaves formed a vibrant backdrop. The ground softened, the mud came alive, and his left boot slipped a foot off course. The guard regained his bearings and continued on, aware that one misstep could turn routine into incident. His peripheral vision tracked a slight oscillation overhead, so subtle it could have been mistaken for wind. A second oscillation, however, was accompanied by a dry crack, a sign that internal fibers had given way. It wasn't panic, it wasn't haste, it was simply confirmation that the situation was no longer neutral. He reorganized his breathing, shifted his weight to the firmer side, prepared to retreat, and recognized, even in the gesture, that the false peace had come to an end. The forest no longer spoke of subtleties. The chorus of rain grew denser, a lightning bolt reshaped the light, and in a split second, the precarious balance of the trunk above transformed into an inevitable fall. The trigger, planted by a chain of human and natural choices, fired with the cruel punctuality of events that seem random and then reveal logic. The trunk descended forcefully, dragging vines, pieces of bark, and a mosaic of leaves, in a blind movement that neither negotiates nor asks permission. The rangers saw the world narrow, felt the impact like a shove the size of the forest, and recognized, before darkness fell, the ultimate evidence that the signs had all been there, from the beginning, waiting for the right reading. The moment the weight fell, the narrative of the perfect morning fell apart. The initial resistance to the signs became a lesson, and the first strange signs finally revealed their intention. Somewhere on the slope, the female gorilla raised her head, noticing the vibration that ran through the ground like a message. The troop dispersed cautiously, and she, guided by something neither maps nor measurements could grasp, set off toward a point that did not yet exist for humans. The awakening was complete. What had been announced as an ordinary day had become the preamble to a story in which instinct, alongside reason, would write the next line. The rain stopped in the early morning, but the sky remained overcast, saturated with humidity and gray. The radio at the control base crackled at regular intervals, picking up only noise and fragments of static. The guard didn't respond. Each attempt at contact ended in the same heavy silence, as if the forest had swallowed the sound waves along with the man. At dawn, the search team was mobilized. Tracking equipment, dogs, drones, everything was prepared for an operation that was gradually taking on emergency dimensions. However, among the humans, The feeling grew that the disappearance was merely a temporary diversion, something solvable, a delay explainable by the unstable terrain. It was more comfortable to believe that. As preparations progressed, on the other side of the slope, the female gorilla awoke with a start. The ground, still damp, held the residual vibration of the collapse. Her instinct led her to a seldom-traveled area, where the smell of disturbed earth and broken wood was still fresh. Every step was measured, every sound interpreted. Along the way, she found a half-buried piece of metal, the guard's badge, covered in mud and leaves. The connection was immediate. That human presence wasn't strange. It belonged to the one who, months before, had helped her when her calf was trapped. The memory wasn't in the form of reason, but of a pulse. She lifted her face, breathed in the heavy air, and followed the direction of the familiar scent. At the base, the guard's colleagues exchanged theories. Some claimed he had gone down to the river and lost the signal. Others suspected a poacher's attack. The differences of opinion, however, were not driven by distrust, but by the fear of accepting the most dire hypothesis. The first drone images showed only destruction, broken trunks, a strip of landslide, no perceptible movement. It was a landscape so homogeneous that the human eye was lost. The searches began in the areas of highest probability, following protocols and mapping. None of them imagined that the true connecting thread was not technological, but instinctive and in the hands of an animal. The gorilla advanced, ignoring the distant roar of the propellers and the intrusive smell of fuel in the air. The forest responded to her passage with warning signs, scattered birds, small monkeys retreating. She crossed streams, climbed ravines, and stopped before a clearing covered in freshly broken branches. The largest trunk formed a jagged obstacle, and beneath it, the earth still breathed warmly. Instinct needed no confirmation. The female's gaze fixed on the spot where a fragment of fabric emerged from the mud, the guard's uniform. The first attempt to remove the trunk was clumsy. The wood was thick, the mud slippery. She pushed with her shoulder, then with her arms, until she realized brute force wasn't enough. She circled the obstacle, assessed the angle, tested the support of the lateral roots. Her body reacted reflexively, as if repeating her movements could decipher the problem. The trunk creaked, gave way millimeters, and her effort redoubled. The smell of blood mixed with the earth confirmed what she already knew. The man was still there, alive or dead, but present. At the command base, tension was rising. One of the more experienced rescuers noticed a strange pattern in the aerial footage, an irregular shift in the shadows of the vegetation. Zooming in, he made out the silhouette of a large animal. At first, there was panic. Perhaps the gorilla was protecting its body, reacting aggressively. The orders were for caution. But as the footage continued, something disconcerting happened. The animal didn't attack. It seemed to move the branches, removing pieces of trunk, in a systematic and careful manner. The operators hesitated between intervening and observing. The commander authorized the approach, but without making any noise. The drone's camera captured the exact moment the gorilla leaned over the guard's body and touched his arm. The gesture was delicate, almost reverent. The human rescue, still distant, witnessed the impossible, a wild animal trying to free a human. In the forest, the gorilla stood for hours beside the trunk, alternating between effort and observation. Her hands, calloused from life in the wild, glided over the wood with instinctive patience. When the wind shifted, she smelled the metal of human tools. The distant sound of voices echoed, and she rose, tense but unwavering. The arrival of rescuers was imminent. At the base, some technicians doubted what they saw. The images were reviewed, discredited, and then confirmed. The evidence was concrete, indisputable, and, as with every unexpected truth, it was accompanied by denial. Some insisted the gesture was merely coincidence, a response to stimuli, an instinct of curiosity. Others, more attentive, noticed the synchronicity. The animal wasn't reacting to chance, but to the life that still pulsed beneath the trunk. As theories clashed, time ticked. The guard remained trapped, teetering between unconsciousness and survival. And the female, alone, kept vigil. No member of the pride approached. Perhaps they recognized the symbolic territory she had demarcated. The isolation was total. The human rescue, on the other hand, faced the dilemma of approaching. A miscalculation could cause the trunk to collapse and seal the fate of the injured man. The forest, at this point, seemed to sustain the plot with the serenity of one who knows the rhythm of justice itself. The man, the gorilla, the rescue team, all interconnected by an invisible thread connecting error and redemption. The proof of intelligence and compassion was already there, alive, even if few accepted it. The antagonist, at that moment, had no face. It was human arrogance in the face of a sensitivity that does not understand. Ultimately, the drone captured the gorilla's last movement before dusk. She retreated a few meters, exhausted, and sat in the mud, observing the inert body beneath the trunk. The shadows of night advanced, and her eyes, reflecting the little light that remained, seemed to keep a silent oath. The isolation had become absolute. The entire jungle was asleep, but in that clearing persisted the vigil of a creature that, without words or theories, remained faithful to what instinct told her. There was life there, and she would not allow the silence to swallow her. Dawn brought a damp chill that clung to skin and tree trunks, leaving the forest shrouded in a thick fog. The helicopter circled the valley in slow circles, the sound of its blades reverberating between the mountains like a mechanical heartbeat. On the ground, the rescue team advanced with headlamps and ropes, tracing safety lines between fallen branches. Communication was fragmented. The terrain made every step a gamble. The clock read nearly 20 hours since the guard's last signal, and hope teetered on the edge of exhaustion. Still, there was something that compelled everyone to continue, a collective premonition that the man still awaited help. The gorilla hadn't slept. All night long, she remained close to the trunk, alternating between moments of wakefulness and attempts to move the wood. Her hands, already covered in small cuts, persisted in a gesture that challenged the limits of her strength. At intervals, she moved away just enough to breathe and return. Her heavy body marked the mud, transforming the ground into a physical record of her persistence. The forest watched in silence, as if recognizing in that effort an ancient liturgy, a kind of compassion that didn't depend on language. In the early hours of the day, a strange noise broke the monotony, the sound of distant engines. The female's gaze lifted. On the leafy horizon, human shadows moved. She retreated, not out of fear, but out of caution. She knew, somehow, that these intruders had a purpose. Voices began to approach, and, among the trees, the reflection of their flashlights traced movements that instinctively recognized as a potential threat. The atmosphere grew tense. The encounter between worlds was inevitable. The first rescuer to arrive at the clearing froze at the scene. The trapped man, his torso partially dislodged, and, a few meters away, the gorilla, motionless, watching. Protocol demanded retreat, but the impact of what they saw paralyzed the team. The animal showed no aggression, only vigilance. Its measured breathing and steady gaze indicated control, not fury. As the others approached, the leader raised his fist, signaling silence. The decision was to wait. From above, the drone confirmed. The animal was not attacking, not fleeing. It was guarding. For long minutes, no one moved. Time seemed suspended, measured only by the sound of water dripping from the leaves. The gorilla touched the trunk again, slowly, and the rescuers noticed she was pushing in the same direction they intended. It was as if asking for help. Then, a gesture changed everything. She looked at the group and moved half a step away, making room. That was enough to dispel the fear. The team advanced, still cautiously, and began securing the cables around the wood. The combined effort became an unlikely choreography. On one side, humans with equipment, calculating angles and forces. On the other, a wild animal that, instinctively, understood what was happening. With each pull of the rope, the gorilla followed suit, stabilizing the base of the trunk with her hands, preventing the weight from rolling onto the injured man. The coordination was almost telepathic. The mud gave way, the trunk moved a few centimeters, and a breath escaped the guard's lips. One of the rescuers let out a restrained sound, somewhere between surprise and hope. The gorilla held her position, as if knowing the outcome depended on precision. It was at that moment that the turning point occurred. Among the crew members, one of the technicians, tasked with filming the operation, turned off the main camera and discreetly stepped back. Years of working in conflict zones had made him skeptical. Deep down, he believed the animal was merely reacting to the movement, without any real awareness of the act. But, upon reviewing the drone footage, he noticed something that silenced him. Even before the human arrived, the gorilla had already moved part of its trunk on its own, opening a passage to the air. It wasn't a reflex, it was intention. The evidence contradicted every comfortable explanation. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the clearing was reaching its breaking point. A louder crack echoed as the trunk broke at the fulcrum. The noise attracted other members of the troop, who gathered among the trees, observing from a safe distance. Fear coursed through the rescuers. One mistake could turn empathy into tragedy. But the unexpected happened. The gorillas remained still, as if recognizing the ritual underway. The female centered herself again, pushed one last time, and the trunk rolled enough for the men to pull the body out. The ranger emerged from the mud, pale, bloodied, but alive. His shallow breathing marked the transition from despair to hope. The group placed him on the stretcher as the helicopter returned. The gorilla, now exhausted, remained standing, watching. Her eyes followed every human gesture, attentive, serene, almost human. When the paramedics lifted the stretcher, the animal took 2 steps back, allowing them to pass. No sound broke the air. The wind from the propellers kicked up leaves and dust, creating a curtain of movement around the scene. And, amidst the turbulence, the gorilla's silhouette remained motionless, firm as a living monument to that which transcends instinct. The helicopter pulled away, carrying the guard. The team gathered their equipment and prepared to leave. One of the men, unable to resist his curiosity, turned for one last look. The gorilla was still there, staring into the emptiness left behind. As the last lights faded between the trees, she slowly knelt and touched the ground, a gesture no one could interpret. Perhaps she was being fired. Perhaps it was gratitude. Perhaps it was simply the silent continuation of something humans have yet to grasp. At the base, the images were reviewed, shared, and studied. Experts discussed what they had witnessed for hours. Some claimed it was learned behavior. Others, more sensitive, recognized something different, a primitive, ancestral empathy. The boundaries between rationality and emotion, between man and animal, dissolved in the face of the video that circulated between screens and hearts. The forest, in turn, resumed its normal breathing. The leaves dried, the birds began to sing again, and the course of life resumed its natural rhythm. The gorilla disappeared into the shadows, returning to the valley. Nothing about her seemed to have changed, and yet, at the same time, everything had transformed. That night had left an invisible mark, not only on the damp earth where the trunk had fallen, but on the fabric of memory that now forever united human and wild in a single act of salvation. The world didn't know it yet, but this would be the record that would cross borders and awaken consciences. The beginning of a story that, in the next chapter, would reach its climax, when humanity, for the first time in a long time, would see itself reflected in the eyes of an animal that cried without tears. The next dawn brought a pale, diffuse light, the kind that seems to waver between relief and mourning. The forest was slowly beginning to recover. The sound of helicopters had already faded, and with it, the brief human tumult that had interrupted the valley's natural respiration. Only the smell of fuel mixed with damp earth, the deep boot prints in the mud, and a thick silence remained, the kind of silence that carries memories. The gorilla, still near the clearing, observed the emptiness left behind. The trunk that had once imprisoned the man remained displaced, covered in new leaves. The scene seemed a makeshift altar to something greater than comprehension. At the hospital, the forest ranger slowly awoke. His eyes opened under a white, impersonal light, and the rhythmic sound of the monitors reconnected him to reality. His body was bandaged, his muscles throbbed, but his brain was still trying to organize the fragments of what had happened. Confused images came and went. The rain, the log, the unbearable weight, then the gentle touch, the warmth of a presence beside him. The memory was real and, at the same time, impossible. When he learned the rescue had been filmed, he asked to see it. The medical team was reluctant, fearing the emotional impact, but relented. The video showed what he hadn't had the strength to see. The gorilla bending over his body, pushing against the wood, protecting him with her hands. No scientific explanation was enough. He wept silently, not in pain, but in recognition. The news spread with a speed familiar to the modern world. The drone footage was featured on websites, news programs, and social media. The video gained subtitles in dozens of languages. Headlines described the event with words like miracle, empathy, and redemption. Animal behavior experts analyzed the gorilla's gesture frame by frame, while others transformed it into a symbol of the lost connection between man and nature. What began as an isolated incident became a universal story. Back in the forest, days later, a documentary crew set up cameras in the rescue area. The vegetation had already begun to regenerate. In the center, among new leaves, marks of the operation remained. An abandoned rope, a piece of fabric, and, all around, old footprints mixed in with the animals. The site had become a pilgrimage site for environmentalists and the curious. But the gorilla had not been seen since the night of the rescue. Some claimed to have observed her from afar, always in the shadows, discreetly monitoring human movements, like an invisible sentinel. When the ranger was discharged, his first decision was to return. Against medical advice, he returned to the reserve carrying flowers and a notebook. He walked slowly to the clearing, where the sound of birds replaced the metallic clang of machinery. He stopped before the fallen trunk and remained motionless for a few minutes, breathing in the air saturated with memories. The forest seemed to recognize the reunion. Branches swayed, a monkey called in the distance, and the wind brought back the scent of wet moss. He knelt, touched the earth, and remained there, silent. It was then that something moved. Amidst the shadows of the trees, a massive black figure emerged. The female gorilla stopped a few meters away. Their eyes met for a moment time could not measure. There was no sound, no closeness. Only the mutual recognition of two beings who had shared the same moment between life and death. She watched, took a deep breath, and, with a serene movement, turned toward the forest, disappearing into the bushes. The man remained there, understanding there was nothing more to say. The video of this reunion, captured by one of the cameras left at the scene, would be the last record of them together. The image traveled the world again, now without the drama of the emergency, but with the symbolic weight of reconciliation. It was a natural closure. The human, in humility before the creature that had saved his life. The animal, in dignity, returning to the silence from which he came. In the following days, schools, museums, and environmental organizations recreated the story. Posters displayed the moment the gorilla touched the trunk, accompanied by phrases such as "compassion is not the privilege of a single species," and "the jungle also has a heart." One animal's solitary gesture had reignited a global conversation about empathy conservation, and human responsibility toward wildlife. The forest continued its cycle. Fallen leaves turned into humus, nourishing new roots. The trunk that once symbolized imprisonment now served as shelter for small creatures. Nothing in nature is lost, it only changes form, perpetuating the sense of continuity. In the late afternoon, as the sun filtered the air in golden beams, the distant sound of gorillas echoed among the hills, a low, serene song that seemed to celebrate the return to the natural order of things. The guard, back at his post, continued working with a different serenity. His gaze carried the memory of a bond impossible to explain and impossible to forget. The world around him continued its hurried pace, but he had learned something only the jungle could teach. Compassion is the oldest language on Earth. In the documentary's final recordings, the narrator concluded the story with a simple and definitive phrase. Even in the wild, compassion is the most human of instincts. The final image froze in the restored clearing, the moss-covered trunk and the echo of the forest's natural drums resuming their eternal rhythm. The truth had come to light, not as a revelation, but as a reminder of what humanity had forgotten. And so, a gorilla's silent gesture became a symbol of a time when love, in its purest form, still existed among the trees.